Okay, today we're going to be learning about Tata'ah Gavar, excuse me, Sim Kofei Halacha Gimel. And previously, we found out that in order for time to transfer, there needs to be heat. It has to be Yatzla display. So that's the regular rule. And in this halacha, it tells us like this: what happens if one of them tells us what to do when one of the things is hot and the other one is not? Like, for example, we take a potato; it's at room temperature, and we drop it onto a hot piece of meat. So now all of a sudden we don't have them both Yatzla display; just one is and one is not. So the rule is Tata'ah Gavar, which is to say whichever one is underneath, that's the one that's stronger. So in our case, that I said to you, take this potato, ambient potato, and put it onto a piece of meat. The bottom one, which is the meat, is hot. So then time transfers between the meat and the potato as if they were both hot. We call it Tata'ah Gavar. The lower one is stronger, and even though the upper one is cold, the lower one is able to cause a transfer of time between the two of them. Now, what about in the opposite case, where the hot meat was on the top and it fell onto the ambient temperature potato? So then we would say is Tata'ah Gavar. The cold on the bottom, cold meaning not Yatzla this way, the cold on the bottom is the stronger one, and there's not going to be a transfer. The full transfer of time is not going to happen. Nonetheless, the Gemara says that it takes a minute or a moment for the Tata'ah to be Gavar. Before it has a chance to be Gavar, to cool down the upper one, the meat, there's a little bit of time transfers, a Kadei Klipa, that just a very thin layer, a layer like that you could peel off. So in order to have a full transfer of time, it needs to be that the lower one is hot. But even if the lower one is the cold one, there's a minimal transfer of time, a Kadei Klipa. Now, just as sort of an aside, is that when the lower one is the one that's not Yatzla display, and the time is only transferred Kadei Klipa, that means is that if there's any kind of a barrier between the two things, then there won't be a transfer of time, because the time can only transfer Kadei Klipa. Well, Kadei Klipa is the barrier that's in between is going to be Kadei Klipa. So an example of that might be in the heat exchanger. If we have hot on one side of the plate and cold on the other side, cooling water against hot product or something like that. Assuming that that's considered an example of Tata'ah Gavar, I'll talk about that in a second. Maybe it is or isn't, but assuming it is, and we'd say we have a Blios Kadei Klipa, well, the plate itself is the Kadei Klipa, and it would prevent time from transferring. Okay, now talking about Tata'ah Gavar, a couple of like rules. Now, I don't know how practical they are for us, but a couple of rules, and they are: first of all, it makes no difference whether the Isser is on the top or the bottom. All that's important is whether the hot is on top or bottom. Whether it's the Isser or the Heter on the top or the bottom makes a difference. Time transfers or doesn't transfer based on where the hot and the cold are. Second is, we assume that the time transfers whether it's between foods or between kelim also. Okay, the Shach brings that there are those who say that if you put into a cold kli, then Tata'ah Gavar doesn't apply, and Tata'ah Gavar only has to do with food, but he says it's not true, and the Ramah himself says it over here, that Tata'ah Gavar applies, the rules of Tata'ah Gavar apply whether the two items are food or kelim, and it makes no difference. And the last thing for here is that it doesn't make a difference whether the items are liquids or solids. That is to say, regardless of whether the liquids or solids, we're going to say that the rules of Tata'ah Gavar work. Now, I have to just clarify a drop, and that is the Mechaber says in a later halacha that it really depends on whether the items are shamin or not shamin, for whether they're liquid and shamin. Those play a role over here. But the Ramah says that our minig is we treat basically just about everything as shamin. So effectively, because we can't differentiate what is shamin, what's considered so fatty enough that it qualifies or not enough. So we treated everything as shamin. So effectively for us, liquid and solids are the same. There is a shach has some exceptions, and there's Shardzian. The Mishabur in Shardzian talks about what happens if a matzah krula touches another matzah. That's also that's a case where it's clearly not shamin. Okay, that's another case. Okay, and one other case where the rules of Tata'ah Gavar don't apply. One case where they don't apply is if the upper one, which is hot, is on the fire. The Shach says that in that case, when the upper one is on the fire, so the Tata'ah can't be Gavar over the continual heat being pumped into the top one that's on the fire. So when the top one's on the fire, Tata'ah Gavar and the lower one is cold, we don't say there's no Blios. We say actually there is a Blia because it's not, the lower one is not able to cool down the top one to the point, even to that extent when it's really on the fire. Okay, now now there is a machlokes, one other machlokes. There's a machlokes about what happens if the two items are side by side. I keep talking about when one's on top and one's on bottom. The Ramah says that when they're side by side, the Ramah by us says there's no Tata'ah Gavar, because neither one is the Gavar. There's no Tata'ah to be Gavar, so you just have a bli of Ketei Klipa. But the Shulchan talks about, maybe it depends on whether it's is or a heter. Which one is the cold one over here? He talks about that, and the Shach, and in the end he sort of machmer in both cases. The Shach is not so happy about that. The Taz says you should be machmer for the Yam Shlomo, except the Makom have some Ruba, and the Chacham Son brings that. Okay, so that's a machlokes about that. Again, what happens when it's side by side? Now, in a minute, I'm going to talk to you about what the logic is for why Tata'ah Gavar works, and we're going to see that the first two of those reasons come from an Isser Heter. And then the very next halacha that after the Isser Heter says that is, he brings that if it's side by side, then there's no Tata'ah Gavar, and it goes together, because the reasons he's going to give are having to do with it being on the top, physically on the top, and if it would be side by side, it wouldn't apply. So it follows these things. The Ramah follows from there, which is the Isser Heter says, here's my two reasons, and therefore, sort of in the next halacha he says, and side by side there's no Tata'ah Gavar, and it's sort of those flow from one another. The two reasons he gives flow into this kula about side by side. What I mean is, I'm going to tell you a third reason for which it's not going to apply. Okay, that was a little not so clear because I didn't tell you the reasons yet. Well, anyhow, okay. So now let's go to some. So those are some cases. So most of those things that I just mentioned, most of those details. Excuse me. And machlokes are not actually so relevant, at least to my mind, in practical nafkaminas. Not so many common cases like that. Now, let's talk about case that I believe is practical. And I'm going to start by telling you that in the body of Shulchan he brings that the place can give three reasons why we say is Tata'ah Gavar. Why is it that the bottom one overpowers the upper one? Okay, and they're similar, but each one is a little subtly different from the next. Okay, and the first two come from the Isser Heter, as I said. The first one is that when the upper thing pushes down on the lower one, because gravity makes it push down on it, so it pushes out heat or cold. It pushes out whatever is in the lower one to the upper one. So it pushes it it's as if like stamping down on the lower one, and that pushes out of it whatever is in it. So in this case, we're not talking about physical things being pushed out. We're talking about like the heat or the coldness gets pushed out. That's his first reason. The second reason is what to us seems simpler, to us more scientific minds, that heat rises. So whatever's on the bottom, the heat goes up. Or so I guess in the case where the upper one is hot, so then it's drawing heat away from the bottom one. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but for sure, if the bottom one is hot, then the heat rises. Okay, and the third reason, comes from Shach, and he says that it's not inherently dependent on which one is upper or lower per se, but it's rather that things that are stationary are more powerful than things that are in motion. So therefore, typically the one that's on the bottom was stationary. It was there first, and then the other one fell onto it or was put onto it. So things that are stationary have more ability to transfer time. His words are the kol shehu b'mekayim hu hagoyver. The thing that's stable and in its place, it's stronger. And now the truth is the Shach thinks that the Rajba is a source for a Ramah in a way earlier Simon. But the Pri Chodesh says, he says, we had a Ramah I mentioned before, and a whole to do about what happens when they're side by side. What happens when they're side by side? The Pri Chodesh says, if the reason had to do with Tata'ah Gavar, the rules had to do with what's stationary and what's on the top, he says there would be like never a case of side by side. He says, what's side by side? Which one is that? There's one should be stationary and one is moving. He says you could come up with a case, but it's very unusual that one was there, so to speak, first before the other one. So these are our three reasons. Okay, now let's see how we could apply these reasons and the rule of Tata'ah Gavar to the case of a tumbler. Okay, what's a tumbler? A tumbler basically looks like a big drum. Imagine a drum that has no ends. It's just the round central part of it. There's no cap on the top or the bottom. It's turned on its side, a little bit of an angle, okay, and it's hollow. So what you do is it rotates. So it's rotating around on its axis. So it's going around and around, and you dump something into the top. Let's say potato chips into the top of it, to the upper part of it, and as it turns, the chips that are in there tumble down towards the bottom. So as they fall into this drum that's rotating, they get sort of picked up a little bit and up and move, and slowly they make their way from the top of the drum to the bottom. And as that's happening, as that's going on, in this case, I'm mentioning the case of chips, the chips are going down from the top to the bottom. There's a sprayer through which a liquid or a powder is being sprayed down onto the chips passing through. And the point is, it coats the chips with something. So, for the case of chips, it would coat it with seasoning. Okay, you want barbecue potato chips, barbecue flavored chips on it. So what you do is you take plain chips that have nothing on them, and as they go through the tumbler, whatever seasoning you want it to be on the chips gets sprayed, and the chips keep. It takes them a few seconds as they get from the top to the bottom, and they keep bumping around as they get turned over and over by the tumbler, and they get seasoning all over them. Okay, and they're used for potato chips and corn chips and French fries and all kinds of other things. What the factory does is all the foods are cooked plain. Let's say all the French fries are cooked plain, just potatoes fried in oil. That's it. They're cooked plain. And then, depending on what kind of fries they want to make, they're going to put the seasoning on in some kind of a tumbler. Okay, so as a rule in a factory that has hashgacha, the plain item, let's say the plain chips, are going to be all kosher and parav. There's nothing in the fryer. The fryer all day is just have potatoes and oil, and they're kosher and parav. But the difference is that when you get to the tumbler, some of the seasonings will be parav. Let's say the barbecue seasoning will be parav, but the sour cream and onion seasoning will be milchig. So the question is, what do we have to do, or is something necessary to be done between one seasoning and the next? Of course, it needs to be clean. But of course, the company would do that anyhow. They don't want their barbecue to taste like sour cream and onion. But is there a kashrus required for the tumbler between one product and the next? Okay, so an important part of this question is that the chips, when they get to the tumbler, is basically right after the fryer. Okay, and as a rule, they're still yad tzedakah when they get there. Okay, it depends on the factory, of course. It very much depends on the actual what's going on in that specific plant. But we're going to make an assumption that the yad tzedakah, they come there basically straight from the fryer, so they're going to be yad tzedakah. Now, I mentioned a different time that potato chips and corn chips are too thin to be considered davar gush. So that means by the time they went from the fryer up to the tumbler, they actually may have gone on a couple of belts even in between. But even if not really, then the whole question we're talking about here is a klisheni. We're not talking about a klirushin because they're not a davar gush. So that minimizes the amount of time that could possibly transfer. Time can transfer, but it minimizes how much it could be. And on the other hand, if we had a tumbler that was being used for French fries or potato wedges or something else thick like that, then it might be a davar gush, in which case it would be considered, it would even though it would be in a klisheni, time could still transfer. Okay? Now, what's relevant to what we're talking about today about Tata'ah Gavar is that the tumbler itself is this, it's not a huge piece of metal, but relatively big piece of metal, and it has chips falling on it, but it's open on the other ends, and usually the tumbler itself is not going to be yad tzedakah display. So when we think about it, it seems like a case of Tata'ah Gavar, which is to say the chips are falling in our hot, or the French fries are yad tzedakah when they fall in, but it's falling onto something cold. So according to the first two reasons I gave you which is from the Isv Heter, so what the reason for Tata'ah Gavar is that either heat rises by itself, or heat rises because something falls onto the thing and it sort of pushes the heat out of it. So that's true over here also. Okay, the hot chips are falling onto the cold device, the cold tumbler. The cold tumbler gives its heat. It does not heat itself up, and therefore we would say Tata'ah Gavar, and we would not have a full transfer of time. Now, the third reason is not as clear. The third reason is depends on the physical, the fact that the tata'ah is the one that's considered to be staying in its place and it's stable, and the other thing is moving, and therefore the tata'ah, the one that's stationary, is stronger. So not so clear what do you say about that in a case like this, because it's true that the tumbler is in its place and the chips come to the tumbler, but the tumbler is constantly rotating. So if it's, should we say that it's stationary? So according to the Rajba, it's stationary, so it's the Gavar? Or should we say is no, it's moving and the chips are moving. It's moving in circles and the chips are moving from left to right. So maybe it's more like a case of side by side, where we said many hold that there's no Tata'ah Gavar at all. Okay, so this is a little bit of a unclear question. Is how according to the Rajba, it depends on which one was the one that was there first. Is this an example of something that was there first also? Now I will mention that the Rajba himself is explaining a case of Tata'ah Gavar in Siman Tzadi Aleph Halacha Zayin, a case of Tata'ah, which it's brought in there. The Rajba, it's a Rajba, they're brought over there also. He's explaining what happens if meat falls into milk. That we say it's Tata'ah Gavar, and the milk is considered to be the Tata'ah because it was there first, and the meat fell into it. Now, when the meat falls into the milk moves also. Okay, the milk doesn't say. Think about it. Think about a piece of meat dunking into a milk. The milk is, of course, going to move. But even so, there, the Raj was saying in that case, even though it moves, but it's still Tata'ah Gavar because it is stationary. It was there, and then the meat fell into it, and the meat joined the thing that was already stationary. Weird questioning is the tumbler is continually in motion. It's not in motion just because something happened to hit it or just for a second. It's always in motion. So I'm leaving that open. Is that considered Tata'ah Gavar or not? According to the way the Raj understands. Now, but the truth is that this is interesting what to think about, and it does involve the shilas about Tata'ah Gavar, but we know that what I said at the beginning, which is that Tata'ah Gavar means is if the lower one is cold, there isn't a complete transfer of tam. But there is definitely a transfer of Kedei Klipa. So that means is that Tata'ah Gavar is not going to, so to speak, save us over here, because even if there might not be a Blia Kedei Kuloi, but there is going to be a Blia of Kedei Klipa, and of course chips are only Kedei Klipa altogether. So in which case we'd have to kasher the tumbler between milchiks and parav, let's say, or between treif and kosher, and the Tata'ah Gavar is not going to help us, even if we treat the tumbler as the Tata'ah, that's not going to save us from having the kasher. Now, that's I believe it's correct. A few points relating to that. Okay, and the first is like this. The Pri Megadim says that when we are confident that something had a b'dli of Kedei Klipa, then we cannot kasher with irur klivushin. Okay, what he means is like this. This that we say that irur is boleh Kedei Klipa, that's a chumrah. That's a shaila. Whether it is are there no blios with irur klivushin? Are there full blios with irur klivushin? Or is it just Kedei Klipa? And we assume it goes Kedei Klipa. So that's, but it's not at all clear like that. It's in effect we're being machmir for that opinion to say it's Kedei Klipa, but we're not confident that's Kedei Klipa. So in cases where we know that the blia was Kedei Klipa, we cannot kasher with irur. If the blia was with irur, we could kasher with irur because we want to. If irur is Kedei Klipa, then to get the blia in, it gets it out also. So and if it's nothing, then it's nothing. But we can't kasher with irur for something that for sure had a blia that was Kedei Klipa, because maybe the blia was for real Kedei Klipa, and the irur doesn't do anything. The irur doesn't affect the time at all. However, that's our case over here. The Gemara says that when you have Tata'ah Gavar and the bottom one is cold, there is a blia Kedei Klipa. So we know that we got that down pat. There is a blia Kedei Klipa. So we should not be allowed to kasher just with irur, even though irur is Kedei Klipa, but irur is only a chumrateitz Kedei Klipa, not enough to kasher in this case. That's one thing. Another thing is that I'm not so convinced that what I said beforehand is correct. We assume like that, and we assume that the Tata'ah Gavar means that there's a b'dli Kedei Klipa and the tumbler gets treif. The issue is that if you think about it, think about what happens in the tumbler. We have a tumbler. The tumbler we're assuming is cold, and the chips are hot. So we say Tata'ah Gavar, and the b'dli is, but even so, it's b'dli Kedei Klipa. But if you think about it, the chips are not what's treif. The chips in most situations, the chips are kosher and parav. Remember, the fry, all it does, or the French fries, all that it does is kosher parav, potatoes and oil. That's all it does, or corn chips and oil. That's all. It's always kosher parav. The milchigs or the treif only gets introduced at the tumbler. So that's ambient temperature. So we're dumping in kosher chips or kosher fries into the tumbler, and they have a transfer of Blios klipa with the tumbler, no problem. Okay, everything's kosher and parav so far, and onto which we're spritzing some milchig or treif spices onto that thing. So what's going to happen? How will the spices are ambient temperature? So they're going to get heated up by the food. They're going to get heated up by the potato chips. They're also a case of, so it's a Tata'ah Gavar, the cold, the ambient temperature seasoning is falling onto the chip, and then it's getting a blia kula, because that's Tata'ah Gavar of hot onto the thing. It's hard. It's not so clear that there's a real blia over there that should then transfer even from there even into the tumbler also to transfer further. Okay, so I mean, if they're kashering from a place where the French fries were treif, like for example, they were using animal fat to fry the French fries, and now they're using kosher oil, so they're kashering the tumbler. So then I get it. The fries that fell into there were treif, and there was Tata'ah Gavar to say that a blios klipa goes into the tumbler. But it's not as clear that we would say the same thing if it was just a matter of a seasoning. Okay, and another case which relates to Tata'ah Gavar is a heat sealer, and that is sometimes, you have a container. I think the most, like a common case where many people have seen this is like these little cups of drinks. They give it on planes, they give it in the hospitals. These little cups of like orange juice, apple juice, they hold like 8 ounces. So you have this plastic cup, and it has a metal foil cover on the top of it. Okay? That's not the only case of those cups, but I'm using that as an example. And the way that cover gets stuck onto the plastic is that the cup, with its metal on top of it, the metal just put down on top of it, and then something hot comes down onto the cover and heats I guess a glue that's in there, and makes it stick onto the plastic. Okay, so it comes down for a second and touches it and makes it hot for a second, or a couple of seconds, enough to make it attach itself to the cup. So in most cases, there's no liquid at all between the machine, the sealer that stamps down on it, and the cover itself. And if there's no liquid at all, then we say ena blue yotze mi kli bleirotiv. There's no blia between the stamper, the sealer, and the cover. So even if what was in the cup was treif, it makes no difference because there's no liquid to help the time transfer between the cover and the sealer. Okay, so that would be a simple case. But if there are cases where the sealer also spraying steam at the same time, in which case there potentially would be moisture between the sealer and the metal, then we would the question of Tata'ah Gavar would come into play. We have this cold drink on the bottom, and we have this hot sealer coming down from on top, and so we would it potentially is an example of a Tata'ah Gavar kind of a case. But the what helps us in this case is the fact that the blia when the Tata'ah Gavar and the hot one on the top, the hot one's on the top, is that the blia is on ketei klipa, and that of course is the cover. The cover is ketei klipa, so the cover might become treif, but who cares? That doesn't bother us. The drink that's in there will not become treif, and therefore there wouldn't be a reason you would not need to kasher that sealer between kosher and treif or milk and power like that. Okay, now there's one more issue. It's too much for us to really talk about now. We spoke about it when we learned about in shchita. It had to do with it's shrink tunnels that are used for meat, and it's also used for cheese also as a way to. It's when you see something in a cryovac bag, a piece of meat, like not a consumerish type of meat. Usually, it's more like a huge piece coming from the slaughterhouse. A piece of meat is put basically into a plastic bag, and the bag is you dunk it into hot water, or you put it through a hot tunnel to get the bag to shrink around and conform to the shape of the meat and to get all the oxygen out. It's a way of so to speak, packaging the meat and transferring it. So we spoke about whether that machine that's used for shrinking the bag around the meat needs to be kosher between treif and kosher meat. So I just want to mention one point that was from there that was relevant to us, and that is that there's a think about the case where we take one of the types of the ways these machines work is the meat is in the bag, and then it gets dunked into that whole thing gets dunked into a hot bath. So in this case, we know that the meat is not getting hot. In there for such a short time, the bag gets hot, and the bag is the bag shrinks to size, but the meat itself doesn't get anywhere near Yatzled. It comes in very cold, and it comes out still way below Yatzled. So I'm mentioning just for today's relevance is that the Aruch Shulchan says that when we have tzonin l'toicham, that's what's going on over here. We're dunking this meat into the hot bath, cold meat into a hot bath. If we're sure that the meat did not become Yatzled, then there's only belief of K'tei Klipa, there's no belief of K'tei Kuloi. Now, K'tei Klipa is great for us because it means Tam won't transfer through the bag. The bag is the K'tei Klipa. So there is such an Aruch Shulchan. But I believe that most people follow the Chavas who says Tata'ah Gavar doesn't require that the item become physically hot, measurably hot. Tata'ah Gavar just means the hot one that's on the bottom causes time to transfer, even though the top one did not become Yatzled. In cases where the upper one is Yatzled, that's not Tzonin l'toicham, that's Cham into Cham. And the case of Tata'ah Gavar is when the top one did not physically become hot, and it's just a shayla halachically should we say that time transfers as if it was hot, even though it didn't physically get hot. So we spoke about this in more detail when we did that about shechita, but that part is I'm just mentioning it for the Tata'ah Gavar angle of it also. I'll mention there's another thing there. Sorry, another thing there that also had to do with that case has to do with Tata'ah Gavar is that the Chavas Das says also that Tata'ah Gavar does not mean that the upper one becomes physically hot, and therefore if we have three layers, the bottom one is hot and the top two are not hot, then there's a bleed between the bottom and the middle, because Tata'ah Gavar says the bottom transfers time into the middle one because even though it's not hot, but there's no transfer of time from the middle one to the top one. We don't say that the bottom one heated the middle one, and now the middle one is a hot tata'ah for the highest one. No, we say the bottom one causes time to transfer to the middle one, even though it's not hot, and then so the middle one is cold. Or if the middle one's cold, it can't affect the top one. It has blios, but it can't affect the top one. Okay, so again, for more details on how dealing with the shrink tunnels, again, back to the shiurim about from shechita. But that's enough for today for Inyan Tata'ah Gavar.